What is the biological purpose of life? What goal do living things pursue as a consequence of being shaped by natural selection? The answers seem varied. Goals seem to differ, ranging from biblical longevity to death by self-sacrifice and from incessant reproduction to life as a sterile worker. To name one of the more bizarre examples, a worker honeypot ant spends its days as a living food container hanging from the roof of its nest. So, what is the common theme behind all this diversity? To answer this question, we need to remind ourselves about the basics of natural selection. We can think of natural selection as roughly analogous to trial and error learning. New gene variants are like different ways to solve a problem. They arise by mutation and then they spread if they change the phenotype of an organism in a way that aids the gene's propagation. They cause something to happen that solves the problem. We can then ask, what kinds of organisms will successful genes contribute to build? Bill Hamilton made a major breakthrough in answering this question in the 1960s when he developed his theory of inclusive fitness. He distinguished two causal pathways by which a gene can aid its propagation. The direct fitness pathway works by increasing a focal organism's own reproduction, and the indirect fitness pathway works by increasing the reproduction of others who carry the gene's identical copies. Hamilton summarized his insight by defining inclusive fitness as a combined measure of direct and indirect fitness. The full definition is: inclusive fitness is the personal fitness which an individual actually expresses once it is stripped of all components which can be considered as due to the individual's social environment, then augmented by certain fractions of the quantities of harm and benefit which the individual himself causes to the fitnesses of his neighbors. The fractions in question are simply the coefficients of relationship. Note the red part, stripped of all components which can be considered as due to the individual's social environment. Because the meaning of this stripping procedure is probably not obvious, let me explain it with a cartoon model. I'll use these cartoons repeatedly, so a few definitions. The blue creature is always our focal organism. In the absence of social interactions, each organism produces two offspring, the little baby circles. This is their baseline production. Let's also assume the organisms are related and that the focal organism has a rare helping gene. So this gene induces blue to help its relative to produce B additional offspring. The arrow shows helping. The benefit B is 1 in this case, but helping is costly. Here the cost C is to produce 1 fewer offspring. We use small squares to denote offspring produced because another organism has helped. The partial shading of the small square indicates that the blue focal organism is less related to this offspring than to its own. So inclusive fitness, here denoted IF Hamilton, is the baseline fitness 2 minus the cost of helping plus the indirect fitness benefit of helping, which is R times B, where R is the coefficient of relatedness. Now, since the focal organism has a helping gene and interacts with the relative might also have this gene and help the focal organism in return. This possibility is indicated by the green arrow. So now our focal blue organism has some probability of producing an extra offspring, the little blue square. This extra offspring is the kind of benefit that is excluded by the stripping part of Hamilton's definition that we saw on the previous slide. Why did Hamilton exclude it? Why isn't green B in the expression for inclusive fitness? Well, Hamilton's population genetic model showed that the condition for a helping gene to spread is this expression, which is known as Hamilton's rule when written like this. The green B is stripped out to isolate the gene's causal effects from the merely correlational component that arises because relatives have correlated phenotypes. What we want to know is what the helping gene did through its expression in the focal blue organism. Now, there's a real limitation to this stripping procedure. It only isolates the gene's causal effect correctly if the focal organism cannot influence what it receives from others. In the theoretical literature, this assumption often goes by the name additive fitness effects. But there's another hidden assumption in this figure. The green arrow indicates that the focal organism might receive help if the non-focal organism has the helping gene. So the green arrow indicates a tendency for the helping gene to be simultaneously expressed in interacting individuals that have the gene. Let's call the tendency the mirror effect, because it implies a tendency to face one's own phenotype mirrored by one's relatives. Now it's important to note that the mirror effect doesn't apply to all genes. There are two ways in which it can be avoided. First, if a gene has a low probability of being expressed in any given organism, then an organism who expresses the gene will mostly interact with relatives who don't express it, even if they have the gene. Second, the mirror effect doesn't arise if a gene is expressed conditional on some asymmetry. For example, if you express a gene to help your younger sibling, conditional on being the older, then he or she will not mirror the favor by expressing the same gene. According to Hamilton, the concept of inclusive fitness serves two purposes. It is a genetic accounting tool to predict selection for a focal gene. A gene is selected for if expressing it increases the focal organism's inclusive fitness. Hamilton then suggested that inclusive fitness is a phenotypic maximant, that is, a quantity which individuals shaped by natural selection should be adapted to maximize. The phenotypic maximant property follows logically from the accounting tool property if long-term evolution proceeds by the spreading of successive genes that cumulatively modify organisms towards increased inclusive fitness. But this assumes that successive genes shape organisms towards a phenotype that serves the propagation of all its genes. Loosely speaking, genes need to pull in the same direction. But do they? No, genes don't always agree about what phenotype is selected for. Consider a case where unilateral helping is highly efficient. Here, 10 more offspring are produced at the cost of only one own offspring. Will a gene spread that induces this behavior? Well, it depends. What if mutual help causes some kind of interference that eliminates the benefits of helping? Then if every organism with a helping gene expresses it, the benefits of unilateral helping accrue only to those relatives who don't have the gene. And as far as the focal gene is concerned, benefits that accrue only to relatives who lack the focal gene count for nothing. So a helping gene that is always expressed and subject to the mirror effect is selected against in this example. But this is not true for a helping gene without mirror effect. For example, let's say these organisms are siblings and a helping gene arises for helping one's younger sibling. This gene is selected for. It causes the large benefit of unilateral helping every time it is expressed. So is helping selected for or against? If opposite phenotypes are selected for based on different genes, how can we predict phenotypic evolution? Our proposed solution has 3 steps. First, we invoke the principle that long-term evolution follows the genome's majority interest. A great metaphor is the parliament of genes. Second, we introduce the idea of a reference gene. The reference gene is a tool to measure the genome's majority interest. Third, we argue that inclusive fitness has to be redefined as the quantity whose maximization best serves this majority interest. Let's begin with the idea of the parliament of genes. This was proposed in the 1970s by Egbert Lee to account for the fact that fair meiosis is so common, even though segregation-distorted genes that bias meiosis in their favor can enjoy a massive selective advantage. Lee wrote, "It is as if we had to do with a parliament of genes. Each acts in its own self-interest, but if its acts hurt others, they will combine together to suppress it." In other words, he explained the rarity of segregation distorters by the principle that traits that oppose the genome's majority interest are eliminated by counter-selection at other loci. Another classic idea we invoke is the idea of individual organisms as vehicles for gene propagation. To quote Richard Dawkins, "We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes." We take this idea a step further by suggesting that we can define an organism's vehicle quality as its general capacity to propagate its genes and their identical copies. We measure vehicle quality by counting the number of copies of a reference gene that can be causally attributed to an organism. The reference gene is a hypothetical gene with idealized properties. It serves as a reference or stand-in for the genome's majority interest. The reference gene is assumed to be present in the focal organism, rare in the population, subject to Mendelian inheritance, and rarely or never expressed. The first 2 properties facilitate measurement. We simply count copies of the reference gene to measure vehicle quality. The last 2 properties exclude mechanisms of gene propagation that face counter-selection from other loci. We can now measure an organism's vehicle quality by counting reference gene copies as follows. Without breeding, any given offspring of a focal individual will on average carry 0.5 copies of the reference gene, and any offspring of a relative of degree R will on average carry 0.5 times R copies of the reference gene. Own offspring are a special case for which R equals 1. Summed over all relatives, including the focal individual, the total number of reference gene copies is this. We can drop the constant 0.5, and if we exclude offspring of relatives that were not causally affected by the focal organism, we can say that a focal organism's vehicle quality is maximized with a phenotype that maximizes this expression. Here, the delta indicates that we count only changes in offspring production caused by the focal organism. Expressed in words, this can be read as the focal organism's own offspring plus effects on relatives' number of offspring weighted by relatedness. We call this the Folk definition of inclusive fitness, or IF-Folk, because it is widely used despite never having been formally justified. It can be found in several biology textbooks, even though it has been emphatically rejected by theoreticians such as Alan Greffen, who called it a common misdefinition of inclusive fitness. The crucial difference to Hamilton's definition is that the Folk definition has no stripping of fitness components. Let's consider some arguments for and against IF-Folk as a phenotypic maximum. We'll start with the against. The first counterargument is the double accounting problem. Let's first note that both definitions of inclusive fitness are the same when all helping is caused by a rare gene without mirror effect. The blue focal individual receives no benefits from its social environment, so there is nothing to strip away. But when the mirror effect is present, a new term appears in IF-Folk. Here, F indicates the probability of receiving help, which is a function of relatedness, R, and the focal gene's frequency, P, in the population at large. The whole green term represents the amount of help that the focal organism can expect to receive on average. Now, you should recall that IF Hamilton predicts selection correctly because it isolates the gene's causal effect from a mere correlational effect. IF-Folk does not predict selection in this way because it includes a benefit, the green B, whose cost, the yellow C, is unaccounted for. This is the so-called double accounting problem that led Greffen to reject IF-Folk, but we argue that this rejection is unjustified. So, what's wrong with the double accounting argument? First, it concerns the use of IF-Folk as an accounting tool for a particular type of gene, namely one with mirror effect. And there's a logical disconnect between saying something about IF-Folk's usefulness as an accounting tool for a particular type of gene and drawing a conclusion about its validity as a phenotypic maximum of an organism as a whole. Second, the double accounting problem merely reflects the general difficulty of using correlational data to estimate a causal effect. As empiricists know, the best way to establish causality is to do a controlled experiment, and something similar can also be done theoretically. Let's reconsider the situation where the focal organism helps the non-focal organism but also receives help in return. How should we measure the gene's causal effect of being expressed in the focal organism? The answer is we can compare it to an experimental or hypothetical situation where the focal gene is silenced in the focal organism. In the technical literature on causality, this is called a counterfactual. Here, the counterfactual value of IF-Folk, marked with a hat symbol, equals the baseline plus the green term. So the causal effect of the focal gene being expressed in the focal organism is the factual minus the counterfactual value of IF-Folk. When this causal effect is positive, we recover Hamilton's rule. So the focal gene's causal effect on IF-Folk does predict selection. The next argument against IF-Folk comes from population genetic models in which complete phenotypes are determined by a single locus with two alleles. We encountered an example of this earlier in the case where unilateral help was efficient while mutual help was not. As we noted, in this case a helping gene that is always expressed is selected against, leading to the prediction that helping should not evolve. Organisms are selected to resist the huge indirect fitness benefit from unilateral helping. Now this seems inconsistent with organisms seeking to maximize their inclusive fitness. But as we've already seen, helping genes without mirror effect are selected for in this situation. The proposed equilibrium where IF-Folk is not maximized is only stable if we make the unrealistic assumption that genes without mirror effect don't exist. so we can reject this counter-argument against IF-folk. Let's turn to the arguments for IF-folk. First, there's the argument from cumulative change. Think about a gene that increases vehicle quality via an initially inefficient mechanism. Why inefficient? Because new traits haven't been perfected yet by natural selection. Other genes that are unlinked to the first can increase vehicle quality, hence be selected for if they improve the efficiency of the trait induced by the first gene. In this way, successive unlinked genes make cumulative contributions that drive phenotypic evolution in a coherent direction, towards increased vehicle quality. Of course, traits that decrease vehicle quality will sometimes be selected for example, those induced by a segregation distorter gene. But such traits tend to eventually be eliminated by counter-selection acting on the majority of the genome. As an aside, let me add that the idea of cumulative improvement has always been the Darwinian explanation for the evolution of complex traits. Darwin wrote that natural selection is daily and hourly working at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life. But while Darwin didn't have a general criterion for what counts as an improvement, we propose that the relevant criterion is improvement of vehicle quality, or IF-folk. Finally, let's turn to an argument about evolutionary stability. We have a logical proof that IF-folk must be maximized at an evolutionary equilibrium. It is a proof by contradiction based on three premises. The premises are: 1. The population is at an evolutionary equilibrium. 2. Genes with any degree of penetrance can encode any mutant strategy. And 3. The current strategy does not maximize IF-folk. If 2 and 3 are true, it follows that a low penetrance mutation could arise that increases an individual's IF-folk, and that meets our definition of a reference gene. Now, because we have defined IF-folk in terms of a reference gene's propagation, a reference gene that increases IF-folk is guaranteed to be selected for. Hence there is selection for a mutant phenotype, which contradicts the premise that the population was at an evolutionary equilibrium. Thus, when we take premises 1 and 2 as given, premise 3 must be false. So, no phenotypic strategy can be evolutionarily stable unless the organisms adopting it maximize their IF-folk. Our argument is almost complete, but we have yet to show that it actually makes a difference which version of inclusive fitness organisms should seek to maximize. So, what, if anything, makes IF-folk better than IF Hamilton? We can answer this with an example called Creel's paradox. Creel's paradox considers a hypothetical species with obligate cooperative breeding. Here, successful breeding requires exactly two individuals working together. One adopts the role of a breeder and the other the role of a helper. Let's assume that our blue focal organism can choose its role, breed or help. The other organism must then adopt the remaining role. So, what should it choose? It seems obvious that the focal organism should breed, because that way it transmits more of its genes. But looking at IF Hamilton, we are led to the opposite conclusion. If we exclude offspring produced due to the social environment, the inclusive fitness of a breeder is 0, while that of a helper is positive if the two organisms are related. But IF-folk correctly predicts that the focal organism should breed. The reason IF Hamilton fails is that it unduly excludes an important part of reproductive success. Hamilton's original assumption of additive fitness effects leads to a special case where this excluded component is merely a constant that can't be influenced by the focal organism. Only then is excluding this component unproblematic, but in general, when organisms influence what they receive from others, excluding this component is unjustified. Let's summarize. We started by asking, what are organisms adapted to achieve? We followed Hamilton's lead in trying to identify a phenotypic maximant, a quantity which individual organisms shaped by natural selection should seek to maximize. We noted that IF Hamilton doesn't generally work as a maximant because it excludes a relevant part of reproductive success. The folk definition, on the other hand, avoids this problem, and it also reflects the genome's majority interest to build an organism with high vehicle quality. And this majority interest leads cumulative multilocus evolution in a coherent direction. So, in a nutshell, we propose that all these organisms will look as though they are trying to maximize their IF folk. But if we're right about this, how could something so fundamental have been overlooked for so long? Why are many people sure that IF Hamilton is the correct maximand? We suggest two reasons. First is the failure to distinguish between a phenotypic maximand of an organism and an accounting tool for a gene. Mathematically, selection on any focal gene can be described with a generalized version of Hamilton's rule, but that's not the same as showing that IF Hamilton is a phenotypic maximand. The second reason is a failure to even notice the difference between the competing definitions. Non-technical texts often ignore the stripping procedure when defining inclusive fitness, even though they intend to refer to IF Hamilton. And of course, this reduces awareness among biologists about how exactly inclusive fitness is defined. Even theoreticians who are aware of the stripping procedure often use verbal definitions that don't mention it and that are therefore unsuitable for distinguishing the competing definitions. For example, inclusive fitness has been called the property of an individual organism which will appear to be maximized when what is really being maximized is gene survival. Let me ask you a question. Here we have a termite queen surrounded by workers. Termite queens lay thousands of eggs daily and can live for decades. They are also utterly dependent on their workers. Few people would deny that a termite queen appears exquisitely adapted as if to achieve some goal. But what is that goal? Is it to spread her genes, or to spread her genes through means that don't rely on workers' help, or to maximize whatever she is genetically programmed to maximize, or is it nothing after all? Answer A seems intuitively obvious. Answer B is absurd because the worker's help is clearly a crucial part of the environment in which the queen is adapted to perform. Answer C and D sound silly, but are only slight caricatures of how some theoreticians talk about inclusive fitness. Most biologists will happily give answer A and point to Hamilton 1964 for justification. But what they don't realize is that IF Hamilton actually corresponds to answer B, whereas answer A corresponds to the folk definition of inclusive fitness. Let me end with some quotes to show that Bill Hamilton himself appears to have been aware of the limitations of IF Hamilton. Here is what he called the generalized unrigorous statement of the main principle. The social behavior of a species evolves in such a way that in each distinct behavior-evoking situation, the individual will seem to value his neighbor's fitness against his own according to the coefficients of relationship appropriate to that situation. Note that this does not mention any stripping of fitness components, so it avoids the limitations of IF Hamilton. And in this final quote, Hamilton explicitly acknowledges the limitations of his definition of inclusive fitness. Perhaps we should not feel entirely confident about generalizing our principle until a more comprehensive mathematical argument with inclusive fitness more widely defined has been worked out. But even from this point of view, there does seem to be good reason for thinking that it can be generalized. Thanks for your interest. To find out more, please read our paper.